Hello, and thank you very much for coming along this evening. This evening we're going to look at developments this last week that have had both national and international implications for survival on Earth and for the prospects of human survival in the planetary system. We're in real trouble here because on the one hand, we're doing things on Earth that make our own habitat, where we evolved and emerged as a species, uninhabitable. And at the same time, government agencies, not only in the United States but around the world, are getting excited about going to other planets in the solar system, as if that's a solution to anything. The reasons for that are rather complex, but they have to do with the history of misunderstanding living on a finite planet. Basically, we misunderstood the findings of all of the early explorers that the world was round. And we began to think of it as an inclined plane, a kind of flat surface for flat earthers to move on infinitely into space. Well, we're about to come up with a rude awakening about that because it's not the case. And yet we're launching moonwalks and Mars landings from a burning planet because of this myth of perpetual frontier expansion, and against which the science of human survival on Earth is making it clear that will not happen. It's pretty interesting when you look at the new efforts to celebrate, in effect, the moon landing of 1969, basically 50 years ago. And we can start to look at some of that in detail because these documentaries are coming out left, right, and center. In fact, most of them are now focused on the whole issue of what a great achievement it was. Take a look.
December 14th, 1972. The final Apollo mission prepares to return to Earth.
As I take me into a step from the surface for some time to come, but we believe not too long in the future. I believe America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow.
As the last man ever to walk on the moon leaves, Gene Cernan dreams of a future when people will return.
We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return. With peace and hope for all mankind.
Very interesting phrase, right? He's leaving the moon for the last time of anyone on that Apollo series of missions, and he leaves with the phrase that's very worthwhile looking at again.
With peace and hope for all mankind.
With peace and hope for all mankind. He's saying, well, perhaps, God willing, we'll return again with peace and hope for all mankind. Very interesting.
But that hope fails to materialize. Years become decades, and there is no return. Now, 50 years later, that may be about to change. Humanity has its sights set on the lunar surface once more. In January 2019, China's Chang'e 4 mission becomes the first spacecraft to soft land on the moon's far side. And a few months later, Israel attempts to become the fourth nation to soft land a robotic probe on the moon.
The idea that a small country could land on the surface of the moon is a very audacious goal.
missions to return people to the moon are also taking shape.
NASA has a plan to build something called the Lunar Gateway, which will orbit the moon as a spacecraft and allow astronauts to shuttle back up and down from the surface.
There's a real sense of hope in the community that we are within 10 years of putting people back there.
But why go back now? What's changed since the end of the Cold War moon race?
Right. What's changed since the end of the Cold War moon chase? Well, actually, there's a whole lot that's changed and a whole lot that's not reflected in this documentary. But let's take a look at how they report it.
Recent discoveries suggest there's much more to the moon than meets the eye.
There are large metal deposits, large amounts of titanium and iron. Space resources will be the next great economic revolution for humankind.
Such resources on the moon could kickstart a new space economy.
Now is the private sector. They want to see if they have a valid business case of economic activity that can happen on the moon.
But with this new economic interest come new questions.
Is it even possible to exploit resources without ownership rights?
Oh, very quickly, question is, who owns this stuff if you get there? This is very much like the frontier of grab and run. Wealth acquisition, and then the early stages of European overseas expansion, followed by Columbus's discovery that it was round, was a kind of scramble to arrive in the New World and plunder it for everything that was there. It was staggering as a structure of logic, and it's now apparent as the same logic that's driving the space exploration. It's no longer governments, it's corporations.
Still, at least 9 private companies are forging ahead, banking on a future that includes regular traffic to the moon. But getting there is still costly and hard to achieve. Staying there, even harder. So what would it take to establish humanity's first foothold on another world?
Well, it's as if, it's not sufficient to live in this world where we evolved as a species and where we can live with an atmosphere that in fact supports human life. We have to go to some other world where there is no atmosphere and mimic in spaceships, spacesuits, the kinds of things that we see here. Take a look. Back to the moon.
The moon is inspiring because it is so real to people. It's something that we see from our houses every night. The moon is this gorgeous record of solar system history, and just a few days away waiting for us to go explore.
Brett DeNevi is in charge of the high-resolution cameras on NASA's latest moon mapping mission, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO.
LRO's mission was to essentially scout the surface of the moon for future human exploration.
LRO was called for in 2004 by President George W. Bush as part of his initiative to return humans to the lunar surface.
Beginning no later than 2008, we will send a series of robotic missions to the lunar surface to research and prepare for future human exploration.
Launched in 2009, part of LRO's mission is to survey the surface of the moon.
The moon really preserves a complete geologic record back to nearly the formation of the solar system.
LRO is offering new insights into the moon's complete geological history. From a point almost as tall as Everest, to giant mare basins half the size of continents, and strange topography unlike anything on Earth. And this is our first look at how the moon's surface is still changing today.
We can actually map the entire moon every month. We're detecting the formation of new impact craters that have formed since we've been in orbit. So that's really the reason why we need these very high resolution images that we get from the LRO to pick out scientifically interesting landing sites to enable future human exploration.
Dreams of living and working on the moon go back a long way. In the early 1960s, the U.S. Army had a design for an elaborate, permanently manned lunar base called Project Horizon. When Apollo astronauts finally arrive, the discoveries they make in the rocks actually add credibility to this dream.
Can you hear this say we may see the purple rock? Find the purple rock? Yeah. Very small, slightly,
Geologist David Crane has spent his career studying their composition.
When the first samples were returned by the Apollo 11 astronauts, scientists didn't know what to expect. Was the moon composed of samples like asteroids that we had analyzed as meteorites? Or was the moon much like the Earth, a complex planetary body? Scientists like myself use what we call a petrographic microscope to transmit light through very, very thin slices of rock to identify the minerals.
The rocks revealed that the moon is a geologically complex world, much like Earth, with lots of different minerals.
Lurking amongst those samples were these basalts. These were samples that we realized were produced when lavas flooded the surface of the moon. And when we analyzed them, we realized that they had minerals that were sometimes accompanied by ilmenite. Ilmenite is a mineral that looks completely opaque in our samples. This mineral is composed of iron, titanium, and loads of oxygen.
With the Apollo-era discovery of the moon's potential mineral wealth, some credible thinkers seriously suggested that the lunar surface could be a source of materials for building bases off Earth. Among them, the legendary science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, and co-inventor of the particle accelerator, physicist Gerard O'Neill.
The Apollo astronauts in many of their flights were picking up just casually chunks of rock on the lunar surface that were 40% aluminum by weight.
And the moon is very rich in titanium too, which we never use enough of here on Earth because steel is so much cheaper. But you can do things with titanium that can be very cute.
By using these resources on the moon, O'Neill suggested that we could build large habitats floating in free space. Such structures would be too expensive to build and launch from Earth, as the modestly sized but costly $100 billion International Space Station demonstrates. But if the raw materials are already available in space, then all kinds of construction activities become conceivable.
Well, that's the theory. You can sort of mine the moon to go somewhere else. I mean, why bother with just staying on the moon, right? If it's got resources that can be used that we can go to somewhere else, that is a kind of stepping off point. Well, you ought to take a look at who, in fact, is behind all of this information that's now spilling out all over the place. It's actually very interesting when you look back at the NOVA program that put this in front of the American public just this past week. Why? Well, NOVA itself is funded, right? In part by viewers like you and me, they say. But it has substantial corporate backing as well. Take a look at the beginning trailer.
humans first set foot on the moon, it may finally be time to go back.
We have seen a little explosion of interest in the last 5 years or so. Now it's not just 1 or 2 countries. It's the whole world interested in going.
This time it's different. This time, we want to stick around.
Now's come the time for us to make the next giant leap.
NASA hopes it will become an enabler for lots of different activity on the moon.
But how would we do that? And why? What's changed since the 1970s?
We discovered that the moon is rich in metal deposits, large amounts of titanium and iron. Space resources will be the next great economic revolution for humankind.
And a critical life-supporting resource.
We think we have found ice.
If we do find water in space, that's pretty much the most significant discovery that we could have.
This is an indication that living on the moon might be possible.
But is it a game changer? Could we actually live off the moon's resources and build a self-sufficient human presence beyond Earth? Are we about to pioneer a new frontier, taking the next giant leap for humankind?
Okay, you get the imagery, right? A new frontier of a sphere. What direction does it go? All directions at once? Is it dissipated out into empty space? It's a linear metaphor of a sphere, has no metaphorical base, cannot happen, right? And it won't happen. But linear metaphors are driving the capital accumulation off the whole thing. So when they see a footprint, they see lots of footprints. They see a frontier, one that they can expand on as if it were a linear space.
There's only one way to find out. It's back to the moon, right now on Nova.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the following.
Our guidance technology took astronauts to the moon and back, from outer space to inner cells. When engineered solutions are needed, we are there, pushing boundaries and delivering tomorrow's capabilities. We are Draper.
It all comes down to a single, defining moment. When a plan stops being a plan and gets set into motion. Today's Merrill can help you get there. With the people, tools, and personalized advice to help turn your ambitions into action. What would you like the power to do?
Okay, there you get it. Draper Labs and Merrill Lynch Bank of America, right? Anything's possible with an engineering firm and the finances. Look who else sponsors this NOVA program.
The David H. Koch Fund for Science, supporting NOVA and promoting public understanding of science. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by PBS viewers like you.
Right. PBS viewers like you are brought in to provide the supplement finances, but the real thing is basically from corporate America. Draper Labs here in Cambridge, WGBH puts out NOVA with the support of David H. Koch Fund for Science, and in fact it's funding for technology, not for science. But it's gotten right through to higher levels. In fact, 50 years ago, Apollo moon landing was the inspiration for this fella, who's now in charge of NASA, he wasn't even born then, to look at Mars. And he wants to take us beyond the moon to Mars. He was interviewed just yesterday on NPR. All things considered.
And I'm going to take you now inside NASA headquarters, downtown Washington. Behind the facade of your typical looking gray stone and glass DC office building is NASA's Space Operations Center. That's an intercom. We're listening in as Mission Control in Houston chats with the International Space Station. Picture a big U-shaped conference table, clocks displaying the time around the world. Kevin Metrocavage, Space Station Operations Manager, is showing us around, and over his shoulder I spot a screen showing video streaming in from outer space. Did you say there's one we can see Earth from?
So yeah, this one here, you can see live.
That's Earth?
Yep.
So you can see Earth from there, but their sights are set on Mars. Well, the fact is, we had fed the heart on fantasies, and the heart's grown brutal from the fear. This has been pointed out years ago from Oxford and elsewhere. Infinite growth on a finite planet is not possible. Infinite expansion off a sphere is not possible. As man's last step on the surface tried to forecall the next step back to the minerals of the moon, we're running out of catastrophically important life support systems here on Earth, including that suggested in this recent report from on farming in Britain. China, meanwhile, is wanting to launch a surface to the mission of Mars to do what? To bring back soil samples to Earth from Mars. Hello.